French thought colonies necessary. Colonies were considered essential to supply natural resources and other essential goods. Like other Western nations, France also thought it was the mission of the advanced European countries to bring the benefits of civilization to backward people. The French began by building canals and draining lands in the Mekong Delta to increase cultivation. The vast system of irrigation works, canals, and earthworks, built mainly with forced labor, increased rice production and allowed the export of rice to the international market. The area under rice cultivation went up from 274,000 hectares in 1873 to 1.1 million hectares in 1900 and 2.2 million hectares in 1930. Vietnam exported two-thirds of its rice production and by 1931 had become the third largest exporter of rice in the world. This was followed by infrastructure projects to help transport goods for trade, move military garrisons, and control the entire region. Construction of a trans-Indo China rail network that would link the northern and southern parts of Vietnam and China was begun. This final link with Yunnan in China was completed by 1910. The second line was also built, linking Vietnam to Siam, as Thailand was then called, via the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh. By 1920s, to ensure higher levels of profit for their businesses, French business interests were pressurizing the government in Vietnam to develop the infrastructure further. Should colonies be developed? Everyone agreed that colonies had to serve the interest of the mother country. But the question was, how? Some, like Paul Bernard, an influential writer and policymaker, strongly believed that the economy of the colonies needed to be developed. He argued that the purpose of acquiring colonies was to make profits. If the economy was developed and the standard of living of the people improved, they would buy more goods. The market would consequently expand, leading to better profits for French business. Bernard suggested that there were several barriers to economic growth in Vietnam: high population levels, low agricultural productivity, and extensive indebtedness among the peasants. To reduce rural poverty and increase agricultural productivity, it was necessary to carry out land reforms as the Japanese had done in the 1890s. However, this could not ensure sufficient employment. As the experience of Japan showed, industrialization would be essential to create more jobs. The colonial economy in Vietnam was, however, primarily based on rice cultivation and rubber plantations owned by the French and a small Vietnamese elite. Rail and port facilities were set up to service this sector. Indentured Vietnamese labor was widely used in the rubber plantations. The French, contrary to what Bernard would have liked, did little to industrialize the economy. In the rural areas, landlordism spread and the standard of living declined. The Dilemma of Colonial Education. Part 1. French colonization was not based only on economic exploitation. It was also driven by the idea of a civilizing mission. Like the British in India, the French claimed that they were bringing modern civilization to the Vietnamese. They took for granted that Europe had developed the most advanced civilization. So it became the duty of the Europeans to introduce these modern ideas to the colony, even if this meant destroying local cultures, religions, and traditions, because these were seen as outdated and prevented modern development. Education was seen as one way to civilize the native. But in order to educate them, the French had to resolve a dilemma. How far were the Vietnamese to be educated? The French needed an educated local labor force, but they feared that education might create problems. Once educated, the Vietnamese may begin to question colonial domination. Moreover, French citizens living in Vietnam, called colons, began fearing that they might lose their jobs as teachers, shopkeepers, and policemen to the educated Vietnamese. So they opposed policies that would give the Vietnamese full access to French education. The Dilemma of Colonial Education. Part 2. Talking Modern. The French were faced with yet another problem in the sphere of education. The elites in Vietnam were powerfully influenced by Chinese culture. To consolidate their power, the French had to counter this Chinese influence. So they systematically dismantled the traditional education system and established French schools for the Vietnamese. But this was not easy. Chinese, the language used by the elites so far, had to be replaced. But what was to take its place? Was the language to be Vietnamese or French? There were two broad options on this question. Some policymakers emphasized the need to use the French language as the medium of instruction. By learning the language, they felt the Vietnamese would be introduced to the culture and civilization of France. This would help create an Asiatic France solidly tied to European France. The educated people in Vietnam would respect French sentiments and ideals, see the superiority of French culture, and work for the French. Others were opposed to French being the only medium of instruction. They suggested that Vietnamese be taught in lower classes and French in the higher classes. The few who learned French and acquired French culture were to be rewarded with French citizenship. However, only the Vietnamese elite, comprising a small fraction of the population, could enroll in the schools, and only a few among those admitted ultimately passed the school-leaving examination. This was largely because of a deliberate policy of failing students, particularly in the final year, so that they could not qualify for the better-paid jobs. Usually, as many as 2/3 of the students failed. In 1925, in a population of 17 million, there were less than 400 who passed the examination. School textbooks glorified the French and justified colonial rule. The Vietnamese were represented as primitive and backward, capable of manual labor, but not of intellectual reflection. They could work in the fields, but not rule themselves. They were skilled copyists, but not creative. School children were told that only French rule could ensure peace in Vietnam. Since the establishment of French rule, the Vietnamese peasant no longer lives in constant terror of pirates.